Please note that some names and locations have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. For the first 3 years after graduating college, I toiled away as a temp worker, bouncing from agency to agency in the hopes of finding somewhere that would hire me for good. The economy being less than favorable, it was hard to find a job in my field. With student loans eating away at my meager paychecks, I decided it was time to lower my expectations and apply for any permanent position with a reasonable salary, regardless of whether or not it fit my skill set. That's how I wound up working for the Office of Risk Management at the local university. My duties were limited to the oh-so-thrilling administrative tasks of following up on a backlog of accident reports, ensuring they were properly filled out, sorting old files and archiving them. Just when I thought I was going to drown in the monotony, I started noticing something strange with several reports. It was Friday afternoon when I realized something was amiss. After a long and boring week, it was taking all my willpower not to doze off on the stack of papers in front of me. Just as I felt my head dipping and my eyelids growing heavy, an answer on the questionnaire I was reading filled me with a deep sense of déjà vu. Were there any witnesses to this event? The employee had checked the yes box and had written a quick description. Yes, a man in a red shirt. I squinted at the simple words on the page. They were so familiar, but I figured my brain was just lagging from end-of-week funk. I'd probably just read the question twice. Without giving it much thought, I finished reading through the document and moved on to the next report. That's when the very same question caught my eye. Were there any witnesses to this event? Yes. Adult male in his 40s, burgundy sweater. It had to be a coincidence, right? I checked the first report again and started comparing the two. The incidents had occurred in different buildings and happened about 2 weeks apart. One dealt with a man suffering from a heart attack, while the other was a simple case of a sprained ankle. The only common elements between the two reports were the man in red and the fact that his contact information was missing. Usually we'd get a name and phone number in case we needed a testimony. I tried to get back to work, but the feeling of déjà vu persisted. I felt like this wasn't the first time I'd read about the man in red. Unable to focus on my insufferably boring job, I started going through the reports I'd archived earlier that week. Sure enough, a man matching the witness description was present in other case files. He was described using a variety of different adjectives, but each painted the same picture. A somewhat tall man with dark hair, in his mid-40s, wearing a crimson sweater and black pants. No contact information available. Yes, middle-aged gentleman in a crimson sweater. Yes, stranger wearing red, approximately 5'9", brown hair. Yes, a guy sitting on a bench, about 45 years old, didn't get his name. It went on and on. The fact that the Office of Risk Management hadn't noticed the reoccurrence didn't surprise me all that much. I'd been looking at these reports all week, and had only been alerted to it because I was reading them back to back. The accident reports arrived weeks, months, sometimes even years apart, so I didn't blame my colleagues for their oversight. There was only one conclusion I could draw from the bizarre phenomena. The man was somehow the cause of these incidents. Why else would he have been on the scene of so many? If he'd only been spotted once or twice, I could have chalked it up to coincidence, but there was a clear pattern here. I had at least 10 reports mentioning him. Was he a disgruntled employee trying to get back at the university for firing him? Was it sabotage? Questions swirling in my head. I went home for the weekend, relinquishing the investigation to my future self. When Monday morning came, I was surprisingly eager to get back to work. Something about the situation had triggered my inner sleuth. With a pair of fresh eyes, I re-examined the reports and drew the same exact conclusion. It had to be foul play. Something had to be done, and I felt it was my responsibility to make sure it wouldn't get swept under the rug. My boss needed to hear about this. With a stack of reports under my arm, I knocked on Mr. Johnson's door. "Come in," he called, voice muffled by the thick wooden door guarding his office. I stepped inside and waved meekly. As soon as I saw Mr. Johnson, I lost my nerve. I'm sure he didn't try to look intimidating, but something about his perpetual scowl and thick arched eyebrows slashed away at my confidence. It'd be unfair to accuse him of being apathetic, but he certainly made no effort to make me feel more at ease. With a flick of the wrist, he invited me to take a seat, while I shakily held the reports against my chest. A deep and calming breath was all it took to give me enough courage to hand him the files. I began pointing out every instance of the man in red, fully expecting Mr. Johnson to take matters seriously. He looked at the papers quietly, rubbing his temples as though battling a headache. The bitter look on his face as he shuffled through the reports made me even more nervous than I already was. I felt like a kid sitting at the principal office, waiting for a review. Suddenly, the stern look in his face broke. He started laughing a hearty laugh as he tossed the papers back towards me. "You shitting me, kid? The school colors are garnet and grey. People wear red all the time to show support. There's nothing weird about it," he told me. "It's not just the shirt collar," I protested. "Everyone describes the same guy, an older white male with dark brown hair." He waved his hand in a dismissive manner. "You just described half the faculty members, kid." He had a point, but even if he was right, and we were dealing with multiple people, wasn't it still strange that the contact field was consistently left blank? "What about his missing information?" I asked. The boss shrugged at me. "You need to lay off the crime dramas, kiddo. There's nothing weird about it. More often than not, we don't get everyone's contact information, whether they're wearing red, blue, or hell, rainbow for all I care. It's not a big deal." Unfortunately, he was right. I'd been so focused on the man in red that I hadn't thought about how we dealt with other witnesses. Oftentimes, several people were listed on the form, but we only collected 1 or 2 names. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my instincts were right, even if the boss argued otherwise. "I'm sorry, you're right," I lied. "I'll get back to work now. Sorry I bothered you." I couldn't risk pressing the matter. The last thing I wanted was for my boss to think I was some sort of conspiracy nut. I couldn't afford to lose this job. We exchanged a cordial goodbye, and I returned to my office. It was time for a bit of an ethical no-no. There was only one way to get more information. I had to contact the victims directly, under the guise that I needed clarification on their reports. It wasn't a complete lie. Their files were ready to be archived and forgotten, but it was the only chance I had. I sent emails to dozens of employees, but only 3 agreed to meet with me. Interview 1. Christine Boone. I was nervous as I made my way to the office of a woman who twisted her ankle outside Les Moreaux, one of the buildings on the east end of the campus. Following her accident report, it was determined she'd slipped on a cracked chunk of pavement. A section of the sidewalk was subsequently demolished and repaved to prevent a similar incident from happening in the future. If nothing else, the Office of Risk Management was efficient at enforcing changes, though it was less about ensuring the safety of students and employees, and more about preventing lawsuits. Mrs. Boone's office smelled like potpourri left out in the sun for too long. Paintings of flowers adorned the walls, and a faux stained glass ornament hung from the window, creaking with each rotation. I had trouble keeping my eyes off the hypnotic mix of colors it projected on the walls. "So you're here about the accident?" she asked suddenly. I took a seat on a patchy guest chair and nodded. "Yes, could you tell me what happened?" I asked. Talking to people was never my strong suit. I wasn't sure where to start or what to ask her. Thankfully, she started telling her story while I followed along with her report. I was carrying a box of supplies to the arts department. I got distracted by something and my heel caught a crack. Before I knew what happened, my ankle snapped and I fell, she explained. I cringed. "Sounds painful." "It was," she replied. "Do you normally take that route?" I inquired. "Yes, but I'm usually careful when I walk around campus. The sidewalks are in awful shape, so I have to watch my step. You're lucky, you know. Navigating this old campus is pretty tough in high heels," she answered, motioning to her stilettos. I glanced at her report, unsure whether or not to bring up the men in red. "You said you were distracted that day. What distracted you?" I pressed. "Ugh, just some weird guy," she said. "Weird guy?" Mrs. Boone nodded. "Just a really weird guy. He gave me the creeps. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk 10, maybe 15 meters ahead of me. He was staring right at me. It made me really uneasy. I was trying to sidestep him when I felt some kind of pull on my ankle. I twisted it and fell. He saw the whole thing happen and never lifted a hand to help me. What an asshole." My lips twisted in a frown. "Wow," I murmured sympathetically. She leaned back against her chair and glanced at the ceiling. "Weird thing is, he just kind of disappeared. I mean, at that point I was standing to my foot, but I swear, one second he was there, the next he was gone." That sounded strange. I flipped through her questionnaire and pointed to the entry about the man in red. "Was it the guy you described here?" I asked. She reached for a pair of reading glasses, took a look at the paper, and nodded. "Yeah, he saw the whole thing, but like I said, he must have ran off or something. Maybe I'm just not giving him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he ran to get help. I don't know." "Have you seen him since?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, but if I ever do, I'm sure I'd recognize him. Something about that dark look in his eyes I'll never forget." That was all I needed to hear, but I asked her a few follow-up questions to make my interview seem a little more legitimate. I didn't want her running back to my boss asking questions. Once that was done, I ended the interview. Interview 2. Andrea Harmon. A few days passed between my first and second interview. By then, I'd practiced what I was going to say. I wanted to come off as confident and professional, but as soon as I saw the woman in front of me, I found myself faltering. Alright, Andrea Harmon was a very attractive lady. The kind of woman that'd stop any man dead in her tracks. She'd suffered a stroke a few years prior while at the gym, but you wouldn't know it looking at her. I swallowed hard and adjusted my suffocating tight collar. I babbled hesitantly. Can you describe what happened to you on the day of, the stroke?" I stuttered. She seemed strangely calm for someone who had suffered through a traumatic event. Then again, it had happened a while ago, so it wasn't as though the pain was still raw in her mind. I just started going back to my normal routine at the gym. You know, trying to get rid of my belly fat. I had to be put on bed rest for the last 2 months of my pregnancy, so I was really looking forward to moving around and getting in shape again, she explained. She certainly didn't look like she had any belly fat on her. "So, you were working out when it happened?" I questioned, regaining my composure. She nodded. "Yes, I remember everything clearly up until the stroke. Then things got a little fuzzy, she told me. Just tell me what you remember, I replied, as I tried my best to avoid looking down her blouse. She drummed her fingertips along her desk absent-mindedly, her eyes wandering towards the corner of her office. I was well into my workout. I picked elliptical 6 because that's my favorite number. So I was doing good, really good. I kept telling myself, that's it, Andrea, keep going, get rid of that baby bump, to stay motivated. Then something caught my attention. The heart rate monitor on the screen turned on. She paused, turning to me to see my reaction. Confused, I raised an eyebrow. The grave look in her eyes suggested I should have noticed something unusual with her statement. What about that? I asked. I wasn't holding the sensors, she said sharply while making grabbing motions with her hands. I had one of those fancy watches with an integrated heart rate monitor. My husband had gotten it for me when I told him I wanted to get back in shape. He was always there for me like that, explained Andrea. So the monitor starts flashing numbers, 90, 100, 145, but I swear I wasn't holding the bars. My own monitor was showing a stable 125, 130 BPM the whole time. Looking back, I guess that was the first sign of the stroke. I guess I was imagining it? But it got worse than that. As the heart rate on the monitor continued to increase, I started to feel like something was pushing against me. Like there was someone on the elliptical behind me, she said, her face contorting in disgust. That must have been pretty scary, I commented. It was. I turned around a few times, but no one was there. Gave me goosebumps, man. Again, I realized it was probably a side effect of the stroke. She paused and frowned. It wasn't long before I saw my face in the mirror. The right half was drooping. I knew something was up right away, and I tried to call for help. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt swollen and I just couldn't get the words out. It was terrifying. I was trapped in my own body, and it felt like someone was touching me. I could feel arms wrapping around my torso and squeezing the air out of my lungs. I could feel hands on my face stretching my skin down. Did anyone notice what was happening at that point? No one, not even the guy on the elliptical to my right. I was so embarrassed to go to the gym during peak hours, so I picked a time where it was empty. But of course, this socially inept jerk decided it was fine to take the machine next to mine, when all the other ones were free. Can you imagine? I kept catching him staring at me in the mirror during my workout, but he didn't react at all when I started having the stroke, she said, sounding appalled. Wait, there was someone next to you and he didn't do anything? I asked, surprised. Yeah, a guy in a garnet sweatshirt. Way too hot to wear for a workout, but who am I to judge? He was going real slowly on his elliptical too, like he was playing out a scene in slow motion. I tried to wave to get his attention, but my arms wouldn't move. That's as much as I can remember. Apparently I fell face first, and then someone finally called the ambulance, she informed me. Did anyone speak to the man in red? I asked. She shook her head. I only filled out the accident report weeks later when I got out of the hospital. By then they said it was impossible to track him down, and he didn't come forward on his own. There were a couple of witnesses who did come forth though, so I figured one less doesn't matter. I pretended to write something on the chart, then smiled and pulled away. All right, thank you very much for your help. I think that's about all I need to know, I told her. Something about what she said stuck with me. I went to the gym a couple times a week. The ellipticals were placed sequentially from left to right, 1 to 6. She'd been on elliptical 6 when it happened, which meant it was the last on the row. How was it then that she'd seen the man in red to her right? Let's make one thing perfectly clear, Brandon said dryly as he escorted me to a quiet room at the far end of the hallway. I'll answer your questions, but make it snappy. I've got a department to run and a meeting in 10. We sat in a tiny space with nothing but 2 conference room chairs, a desk, and a landline. The suited man in front of me fiddled with his cell phone, never giving me a second glance. It was clear to me that he had only agreed to meet because he thought this was mandatory. I was determined to make sure he never found out it wasn't. He looked like the kind of guy who'd easily have fired me if he discovered the truth. Right, I just want to go over the accident report you filed a couple of months ago, I said nervously. Already I could feel sweat trickling down the sides of my face. Mr. Druga rubbed his thick salt and pepper beard with one hand, while entering emails with the other. What about it? He asked impatiently. I knew I didn't have much time with this guy, and frankly, I didn't want to spend much time with him anyways, so I cut to the chase. You reported seeing a man in red. I was wondering if you could tell me more about him, I requested. For a split second, the stern expression on his face faded. I could have sworn I saw fear in his eyes. However, it wasn't long before his poker face reappeared. He was in the stairwell when it happened, on a platform between 2 flights. I didn't hear him go up or down the stairs ahead of me, so I think he'd been standing there for a while, he uttered, lowering his voice. He didn't look right. I can't really explain it. Something about him made my damn skin crawl. Did you speak to him? I asked. Yeah, I asked him what the fuck he was doing here, but he just glared at me. Then I started feeling winded. I'm a healthy guy, okay? I don't care what the doctors say. I didn't have cholesterol problems. My ticker was fine. There was no reason for me to have a heart attack, he said, slamming his hand against the desk angrily. Was he implying what I thought he was implying? Did he just have too much pride to admit he had health issues? Before I could ask another question, he spoke again, his voice even lower. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care how crazy this sounds. I'm telling you, that guy, he wasn't normal, murmured Mr. Druga as he averted his gaze. He gave me that heart attack. I just know it. I was taken aback by his bold claim. You mean because he startled you? The man shook his head, but didn't volunteer more information. It felt as though Brandon Druga wanted to say more, but couldn't bring himself to open up. He needed to be coaxed. Hoping to gain his trust, I took the honest route and explained myself. Do you think he triggered the heart attack somehow? Look, Mr. Druga, I don't want to be forward, but I've been researching this man. I don't think you're the first person who's seen him. I think he's been going around campus hurting people. I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, but I need more answers. Can you help me? Brandon Druga hesitated once more, then finally opened up. What I tell you today, you can't repeat to anyone. Understood? He asked. Understood. I don't think it was human. This is going to sound insane, but I know what I saw. He didn't have a reflection. He didn't have a shadow. And his legs kind of faded halfway down, whispered Brandon in a voice so low I had to strain to hear him. I swear, he was some kind of ghost. That was the last thing I expected to hear from someone like Mr. Druga. I think Brandon saw the look of shock in my eyes. I hoped it wasn't going to make him clam up again. Thankfully, he finished. I felt fine until I saw him. The entire stairwell suddenly became cold, and I started feeling pressure in my chest. I fell over, clutching my shirt. Just as I started blacking out, I heard him laugh. Next thing I knew, I was being pulled onto a stretcher. We sat there in silence for a long moment. I was digesting what he told me, and he seemed lost in thought. An alarm on his phone went off, causing me to jump out of my skin. Your meeting? I asked. Yeah, he replied. "Thank you for your time. I promise I'm not going to tell anyone you told me about this," I said. He gave me a short nod and headed to the door, but stopped as he passed the threshold. "Tell me how you get to the bottom of this, okay?" he requested. "Yeah," I answered. Once the interviews were done, I returned to my office and glanced at all the reports that mentioned the man in red. I spread them across my desk to try and find a connection. When I ran out of the desk room, I used the floor. It was as I was spacing them out that I finally found the link between them. Every single sighting of the men in red had occurred in or around the same 4 buildings. These weren't just any random buildings on campus either. They formed the perimeter around one of the university's main parking lots. Even still, the buildings had very little in common, except for their proximity. Vanier, the oldest of the four facilities, was built in 1954. It closed down for a while, but was renovated recently to make room for the School of Psychology. Montpetit, found diagonally across the parking lot from Vanier, was built in 1973 and has since been host to the gym, a swimming pool and the largest library on campus. Lamoureux, Montpetit's next-door neighbor, was built in 1978. It was later connected to Montpetit and Vanier through a series of overpasses. FSS, the university's shiny new state-of-the-art social sciences facility, was finished in 2012. Although floors connected to Vanier, some consider it to be a new wing of the old building. Like I mentioned before, at the center of these 4 buildings was a parking lot. This summer, the lot was fenced off for construction work. The university wanted to turn the area into a green space and courtyard. It was supposed to be done by the start of the fall semester, but construction crews came across several setbacks. The most notable of which was the car they unearthed about a month ago. The license plate on the car dated it back to the late 1960s. Apparently, before the parking lot was a parking lot, there had been some sort of student housing facility, which had been bulldozed in the early 1970s. It was assumed the car had been abandoned inside the old residence and buried along with it. I decided to cast a wider net, going back through decades of accident reports in and around those 4 particular buildings. I found the burgundy-clad man every so often. He was first seen in 1975 when the scaffolding came apart and caused a construction worker to fall to his death. He was present in 2003 when a student slipped on the ice and was paralyzed from the waist down. He watched from a window when a young woman fell down the main stairs and broke her arm. And he was even spotted sitting in a reading room in the library when a man suffered a seizure. He was all over the place, with reports dating back 20, sometimes even 30 years. Today, construction work on the parking lot came to a complete stop. The area was cordoned off by police. I walked by just in time to see them pull out the skeletal remains of a man in an old, tattered, red pullover.